Sharon Peacock. I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome. My name is Sharon Peacock. I'm Professor of Public Health and Microbiology at the University of Cambridge, and I also direct COG-UK, which is the COVID-19 Genomics UK Consortium. Now, we have a Women in COG event, which we are very passionate to continue. And I'm really delighted that today we have Dr Magdalena Skipper with us to talk about her life and her work that she does. Now, Magdalena is Editor-in-Chief of Nature and Chief Editorial Advisor for the Nature portfolio. She's a geneticist by training, and she holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Now, in the past, Magdalena has also worked as the Chief Editor of Nature Reviews Genetics and Senior Editor for Genetics and Genomics at Nature. And so she has a long track record of working in this field, but she's also very passionate about mentorship, research integrity, and collaboration and inclusion. And in fact, as part of her desire to promote underrepresented groups in research, in 2018, Magdalena co-launched the Nature Research Inspiring Science Award for women early career researchers. So Magdalena, a really very warm welcome to our Women in COG series. I'm thrilled that you've been able to join us today, and I'm really eager to hear what you have to say. So in a moment, we will begin a 30-minute discussion between Magdalena and Dr. Catherine Ludden. So Catherine is Director of Operations at COG-UK. And after that discussion, you, the audience, will have a chance to ask any questions that you have. So please do put your questions into the chat, or you'll be able to raise your hand via Zoom or ask your questions in person. To let you know that the meeting is going to be recorded, and that will appear on our Women in COG YouTube channel. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Catherine and Magdalena, and I'm very much looking forward to what you both have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And I can just simply echo what Sharon mentioned there, is that we're so delighted to have Magdalena join us from Women in COG. And I feel very privileged, Magdalena, to be able to interview as part of this series. And everyone know of the exceptional story that you have. And I'm delighted that you can share your story with everybody today. So
Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So for anyone who hasn't joined a Women in COG event before, it's going to be just a very informal conversation between Magdalena and I, just to kind of get a flavor of the background and how Magdalena has gone into the career that she's chosen. And also Sharon mentioned we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please don't be shy about questions. Please do put them in the chat. And if you'd like to ask Magdalena yourself, as Sharon mentioned, please do raise your hands, and we'd love as much engagement as possible from the audience. So to get started, without further ado, Magdalena, would you mind just giving us just a brief introduction to, what it was like growing up, and how did you become interested in science?
Sure, of course, a pleasure. So, when I think about growing up, I just have this memory of a very happy, carefree person who developed an interest in science and a sort of hunger for knowledge from a very, very early stage. In fact, I don't remember not being interested in how things work and why things are the way they are. I once heard someone say that we're all born with the curiosity of a scientist, and then somehow at some stage in life, we stop paying attention to that part of ourselves. And then I guess I never stopped paying attention to that part. And so as I said, I've always been interested in science, not only the knowledge, but also indeed how things work. And that, of course, is an approach of a scientist. One other thing which I think is relevant for this audience, and I have thought about more and more recently, relevant thing in relation to my childhood and really early days, is that I remember growing up and being treated by my parents, my family, my teachers, and so on, as predominantly me and only secondarily as a girl. It's something that sometimes comes across differently for different individuals, and perhaps those of you in the audience will have your own reflections on this. I don't have any memories associated with, for example, saying that, you know, something is not appropriate for me to do, or I should not do something because I'm a girl. It was always, you know, if you're interested in something, you should pursue it, you should try it.
That's wonderful to hear, and we've definitely had mixed reactions from speakers in the past about some finding it more challenging being a female and some not. So I think it's wonderful to hear that, you know, there is lovely positive stories where, you know, you can, you know, feel that you're given the opportunity. And I think it just shows that, you know, we are coming along and there is progress being made in that area. And just to kind of get a flavor more of your research, I know, as Sharon described in your bio, you did your research in Cambridge, but then you moved on towards science publishing, and of course has had a very successful career in publishing. What made you decide to move away from academia, and really what drew you to publishing?
So, you know, my story, my decision to move away from academia is, quite frankly, a very common story of an editor, somebody who once upon a time did research and has moved towards scientific publishing and scientific editing. And I can summarize it best as follows. So, as I already indicated, I've always been interested in science. I've always had this hunger for knowledge. That is really what gets me out of bed every day. And I don't think that will ever change in my case. But as I moved through various stages of, let's say, knowledge acquisition, I remember being incredibly excited when I was an undergraduate at university, because, you know, if you think back to that time, it's a time when you just absorb information across so many different disciplines. You're like a sponge. Every day you're learning something new, and it's all incredibly exciting. And then you decide that you really love science and research, and you want to pursue some kind of a research career. So you embark on your PhD, and almost immediately you have to zoom in on a topic. By definition, you're going to do a PhD to study something. I found it incredibly exciting and appealing that I was going to be able to make some kind of a contribution towards addressing the question that I chose to pursue during a PhD. But quite quickly, I also became frustrated because, of course, answering that question absorbed all of my time. And there were lots of other interesting questions, some of which had already been answered, that I had no time to pursue. And so after a PhD, I went on to do a postdoc. But all the while, at the back of my mind, there was this frustration that in order to pursue my own research, I necessarily needed to focus in. But I really had that hunger for more broad knowledge in genetics and biology, but also in other disciplines. And so now, from perspective of time, I think of it as a sort of almost an hourglass of experience, that you start very broad when you're beginning to learn these things and you absorb all the information, and then you zoom in. And I think ultimately, if you stay in academia, eventually you're able to zoom out, because of course, if you set up your own research group, you expand your interest, you have more collaborators, also people working in your lab. I suppose I wasn't patient enough to wait for that moment. And for me, it was moving to science publishing, to being an editor, that really offered that outlet, that possibility to broaden out. And, you know, as you heard earlier, I moved from a postdoc to be an associate editor initially, and then chief editor of Nature Reviews Genetics. And of course, it was reviews. So reviews are commissioned on that journal. And so it was an opportunity to work with the research community, with those who are going to become our authors on the journal, to really put my arms around genetics. And of course, it's such a broad discipline. And if you think about it as a way of approaching problems, as a tool or type of methodology, then it can be really all encompassing. So it was that desire to be broader that led me to move away from original research to working in science publishing.
Thank you. And I think that's a wonderful description of, you know, why people should think about publishing. And I think a lot of people on this call may have been exactly in that same situation of, feeling restricted to that certain field. So for anyone on the call who really wants to ask more about that at the end in the Q&A, we can certainly going to go back to that, more kind of what life is like as an editor. I'm certainly going to just expand on that a bit in my next few questions, Magdalena, I hope you don't mind. But first of all, I don't think we could go through today without congratulating you, of course. For anyone who didn't know, and we briefly said it, that Magdalena was the first ever woman to be editor-in-chief of Nature in its 150-year history. But of course, getting to that senior level requires a lot of leadership. And we'd like to talk about leadership on this call, particularly about how people approach it. And for me, I just want to know if you could give us a bit more information on what steps did you take to progress into your leadership role at Nature? And what advice could you give to others looking to progress into leadership roles similar to yourself?
Well, thank you very much. I should put it into a context. So, 2 years ago, we celebrated 150th anniversary of Nature. And it's obviously a role that suits the ones who come to occupy it, because you mentioned I'm the first woman in this role, but I'm also only the 8th editor-in-chief of Nature. So the opportunity to come into this role doesn't come that often. So just to give it a context. Also, your question may give all of you who have joined us this erroneous impression that I somehow had it all planned. And of course I didn't. What has driven me, and I hope you got a taste of it when I responded to your other question, what has always driven me was my interest. What really drives me, what interests me, that is very closely linked. And perhaps it's because I'm not the most disciplined of people on this planet. So I think if I'm not fully engaged and passionate about something, I find it quite difficult to commit to it and engage with it. So in terms of sharing advice, just looking back at my own steps in my career and thinking about comments that others have made about the steps that I have taken, I'll give you one specific example. So I spent 7 years as a senior editor for genetics and genomics at Nature. It was an incredible time of real engagement with the genetics and genomics community. It was a real heyday of, genome-wide association studies and applying whole genome sequencing, also exome sequencing into populations, in disease context. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful time. And at some point, I decided to move on and take on another role, which was more of a management overseeing role. I became an executive editor for a group of journals called Nature Partner Journals. And each journal publishes in a specific discipline, but collectively they really spanned across all disciplines in research. And a number of people made comments to me to suggest that this was a very surprising step, and it wasn't clearly a step on a career ladder. But I chose to do it because my interest drove me to do so. I so enjoyed working in that role in Nature, and in many ways I could have stayed. But again, I had that hunger to experience, how other disciplines worked, what the challenges of other researchers were, and so on and so on. So this, I'm giving you this example to illustrate that my advice would be to follow your interest. If you're true to your own interest, you're true to your own sort of compass and desire, it'll take you where you need to be. And whether that appears to be upwards or in some other direction, that's sort of incidental, I think.
Thank you, Magdalena. It's wonderful to hear about, encouraging everyone to pursue what they love and what they're interested in, doing a career that they enjoy and not just the expected career. So I think it's wonderful that you can, you just explained your story and how you've done that, and it's worked out, and clearly you've been successful, but also enjoy your role. And I think that's really wonderful. And I'm delighted you could share that with us. You also touched on that there's sometimes challenges, and I'm just wondering, have you faced challenges related to being a female in science, as you went up the ladder, and how did you overcome those challenges if you did face them?
It's such an important question. I think every woman has faced challenges, whether it's specifically in science or science-related career, or for that matter, perhaps outside of the topic that we're focusing on today, in another walk of life. I have to also say that in general, I've not faced particularly harsh adversities, but sometimes it's the little things. I remember, for example, in a social context, meeting some former colleagues who, instead of asking me how my new professional venture was going, they would comment on my appearance or on my dress or something like this, which of course I was delighted that they appreciated the way I looked. That was very nice. But I really hoped that they would have taken an interest in my professional life, because after all, our connection had been in the professional sphere. So it's a very seemingly insignificant example, but I think each one of the women on the call will identify with it, that it's sort of situations in which you're almost slighted or somehow overlooked because you're a woman, or because the way you put your point across is maybe less forceful or less loud than somebody else in the room. I don't have a magic solution for how to overcome these situations. My own way of dealing with it, or with them, is just not to give up, to just sort of soldier on, as it were, and persevere. Yes, I would actually, having said that, I know it's a conversation with me, but I would love to hear maybe comments from some of you in the audience, whether you have found a particularly successful way of overcoming these adversities or situations similar to the one I described.
Certainly. So for everyone who's listening, if you have any examples or suggestions and how we can, promote equality, but also kind of deal with these situations where, we may feel that we've been treated different as a female, please do put them in the chat or raise your hand and we can come to them. That would be really appreciated. And I think we can leave, following on that, to the discussion and maybe more towards, I know, Magdalena, you've done a lot of work with collaboration. You've kind of touched upon working with reviews and kind of looking at people from different fields and bringing them together. But can you just describe a bit, how important is collaboration to you, both internally within the organization, but also between different interdisciplinary fields? And this is something that we've seen quite a lot in COG-UK. We've had to work together in the pandemic, which is unprecedented times, but is that something that you do all the time in editing?
Thank you for this question. I think it's an incredibly important issue, and the importance of collaboration cannot be underestimated. If you think about how you do science and what you do in science, you never do it alone, even though sometimes scientists can feel lonely, but that's not the same thing as doing it alone. You always do it in a context. You exchange information, you collaborate, whether it's with your closest group or more distant collaborations. I think it's time to think about collaborations even more creatively. We sometimes don't put the collaboration label on it, but for example, in the context of COG, it may be collaborations with patients or individuals who are involved in that non-scientifically professional way. But these are collaborations. Increasingly in collaborations around, for example, trials, clinical trials, or for a completely different discipline, design of interventions, let's say in the field, in the context of agriculture or biodiversity. We increasingly talk about co-creation, so taking that collaboration even further, working together with individuals who are not necessarily trained as scientists, but who help direct us, our efforts, in a much much better and more appropriate way. And of course, the really sad aspect of this is that within the research ecosystem, we don't value collaborations sufficiently. If you think about it, our world is full of identifying individuals who we glorify as a proxy for work that has actually been done as part of a collaboration, as part of a team. And the unfortunate truth is that most of the individuals that I'm referring to throughout history have been men, and mostly have been white men also. So I do think part of my enthusiasm and zeal to promote collaborations is to recognize their importance and to convince others that we should be recognizing and rewarding collaborations. There is also increasing research evidence to suggest that collaborations lead to more innovative research, especially if they are new collaborations, if individuals or groups who previously had not collaborated come together. So it's a way of reinvigorating our research, our findings, our conclusions. And of course, when we think about collaborations, we have to ensure that they are equitable, that those who come to collaborate receive the credit for the contribution that they make. And it's not always easy, but it's one way in which, for example, we as editors can contribute in the context of collaborations when they come to be formed and when the outcomes come to be published.
Thank you for describing that. And I think you really summarized how important collaboration is, and that, you know, for anybody who's not collaborating quite widely, really the values of doing it. And I think that you can gain more from collaboration because you learn from different expertise, as well as, you know, the scientific publications that may follow. But that kind of two-way learning, I think, is so important. And, you know, thank you for sharing that. Unfortunately, I couldn't go through today without kind of touching about what's happened the last year and a half, as it's been quite challenging. And, you know, just to kind of see from your perspective, what challenges have you faced as Nature editor during arguably the most fast-paced period of change in genetics and genomics? And how did you deal with that change?
Yes, I think, you know, for all of us, the rest of our lives will be forever marked in a number of ways by the pandemic, which is still very much ongoing, although our lives here are returning to normal, sort of, a new normal, I guess. But of course, elsewhere in the world, the pandemic very much continues. Specifically, you know, it's not just me at Nature, of course, it's all of my colleagues here. You know, for example, I remember very clearly when in the UK, so I should explain that although Nature itself has team members that are based in many different locations around the world, most of us are based in London, and our production team is also based in London. And of course, Nature is published on a weekly basis. And so when the first lockdown was introduced in the UK, we suddenly, with very little notice, found ourselves needing to produce an issue of Nature when everybody was working from home. And that was an incredibly steep learning curve, just one specific example. And of course, you know, my colleagues mainly were able to rise to the challenge, and the issue was published without a delay. But then, of course, what continued was this deluge of submissions to Nature, and of course other journals experienced that as well. And what's important to realize that it wasn't just in the fields that are relevant to COVID itself. So, you know, you mentioned genetics and genomics, of course, both of pathogen and host, but also, and then associated fields, of course, immunology, public health, etc., etc. But of course, there was also an incredible increase of submissions of manuscripts in other disciplines, because so many researchers found themselves away from laboratory settings, so they couldn't continue their research. So of course they turned attention to finishing writing up those papers that were almost ready, or just a little bit, you know, maybe a few additional analyses were required. So right across the board, all of the editors on Nature, and indeed, as I say, other journals, found themselves really under this avalanche of submissions. And of course, like everybody else, this was the time of lockdown, schools were closed. Many of Nature editors are women who unfortunately found themselves during the pandemic bearing the brunt of childcare and looking after the household, as well as continuing to work. I'm sure I'm not giving you examples that you're not familiar with. So it was a time of a real challenge. On top of that, and that'll be the last thing I mention, is of course this incredible responsibility and knowledge that during the pandemic-related research needs to be at once published really quickly so that research can build on almost in real time, but also needs to be evaluated really rigorously and thoroughly. Sometimes there is a trade-off between speed and rigor, but very clearly this was a situation where there could not have been a trade-off. So there was, it was a difficult time, and I'm incredibly proud of how all the editors have pulled together, and of course how the community has come to work with us, because of course it's not just the editors, it's the incredible peer reviewers who worked with us to ensure the rigor of these publications.
Thank you. And as a scientist, I'm very grateful on behalf of the science community for all of the work that you've done, and keeping the publications going when it certainly hasn't been easy with those challenges and many more. So just a thank you, for me, it hasn't, we sometimes don't hear about all the challenges. We think about our own. So sometimes good to reflect on, from an editor's point of view and from your team about what you face and still manage to overcome them. I'm conscious of time and I don't want to be, asking all the questions. So I'm just going to end on one question. It relates to mentorship. You're quite passionate about mentorship. What advice could you give to people who want to mentor people, and what approaches would you give advice about?
We talked about collaborations before. Now, mentorship is another example of something which I think we all agree is incredibly important in science, and yet underappreciated. So, for example, in Nature, we also have an award which specifically rewards individuals who are outstanding mentors, both as a lifetime award and a sort of mid-career award. And the way this award works, incidentally, is by nomination. So it's the mentees who nominate their mentors. So again, a very important function that all of us perform, if you like, or should perform. My advice to mentors, I think the most important thing is to keep an open mind. There is no one size that fits all. Your mentees should guide you in terms of what kind of mentoring they need, what they require. And another piece of advice would be, which actually, what I'm about to say is my advice to everyone, both mentors and mentees. Let yourself be mentored. So as a mentor, you can be mentored by your mentees. So sometimes it's referred to as reverse mentorship. It's something I've become aware of actually relatively recently, but I find it incredibly valuable. Often we think about mentorship as a more senior person mentoring a more junior person, but it can be incredibly valuable and incredibly successful when it works the other way around. But for mentees, it's not going to work if you don't let your mentor, whoever they are, if you don't let your mentor you. So let yourself be mentored. Open up to advice on the understanding that you may not adopt all of it, and that's fine.
Thank you. And I'm going to move to the Q&A, but please feel free to ask any other questions on the topic of mentorship or anything else that has came up, just because I'd want to make sure everyone gets time to address the questions. The first one is more of a comment from Katharina, who says it's important about bringing in more diverse voices to change the culture of that one-dimensional environment. For example, not trying to match a certain style of comms to be heard, but embracing a multitude of comm styles. I just wanted to do any comment on that.
Absolutely, very, very important comment, that diversity of voices and perspectives. For example, what you just talked about in the context of mentorship, this stage of career brings in diverse perspective, also really important in different contexts. In terms of communication, in terms of evaluation, commenting, it comes across, for example, in peer review, early career researchers peer review papers in a different way from established researchers, which is equally valuable from a different perspective. But also, communication, when I hear, as an editor of a journal, when I hear about communication, I interpret that in many different ways, including how we convey the science that we publish, or news related to science, or news about science, how we communicate that, what methods, what modes of communication we use, speaking to different groups, different constituencies, but also who we offer the platform to address different constituencies. So I 100% echo that comment, really important comment.
Thank you. I'm going to merge two questions because one adds on to the other. So excuse me, it's going to seem quite long, so you can try address it the best way that you feel fit. It is, what does a typical working day look like? Do you work evenings and weekends? And how has the proportion of typical work activities changed between editor, senior editor, and chief editor?
Very good question. So I'll start from the end. So it really depends what role in sort of scientific editing and publishing you have, what your day looks like. So to give you an example, when I was, what we call a manuscript editor. So for example, when I was senior editor for genetics and genomics at Nature, most of my day would be spent reading papers, evaluating them, searching additional information, maybe arranging calls to researchers to talk about their work, looking for peer reviewers. So really immersed in sort of knowledge acquisition, processing knowledge, serving the authors and reviewers and so on. So there was a certain pattern to my day, which was quite predictable. The content that filled that pattern, of course, was very different, because within any one day, I would have read many different papers, some of which I knew were coming because I'd been to a conference or done a lab visit. So, and I invited that submission to come to Nature. Others were a complete surprise. And often it's the ones that were a surprise that are in many ways most memorable, almost by definition. Although of course it's not part of a typical day, one of the things that editors always do as a very important part of their role is travel to conferences and do lab visits. I don't have to remind you, of course, that over the last 18 months, none of us has gone anywhere, almost quite literally. And of course, that has become virtual, indeed, what we're doing right now. So conferences, you would have all been attending virtual conferences. And of course, editors have done virtual lab meetings as well. My day now is quite different. I do much more external outreach and engagement, a little bit of what we're doing now, giving talks, presentations about what we care about at Nature and how we can work with the research community to help make research better. And by that, I mean more rigorous, more just, and more equitable. I take part in discussion panels, and of course I also internally interact with my whole team, the magazine part of Nature, so that's mainly made up of science reporters who work to a different dynamic, but also manuscript editors, so that we discuss specifics about science, things we have under consideration in Nature, what future direction, what strategy, how we're going to plan that. So there is no such thing as a typical day for me now. But my role is sort of quite specific in that sense. So it really depends what type of an editor you are, at which stage of a career you are. And incidentally, if any of you is more interested in more detail around that, then I'll be very happy to engage with you. Just email me. I can share in my email address, and also you can find it on the Nature website.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take a step back, because there's questions about how to actually get into the career. So again, I'm going to merge two questions in the interest of time. So again, excuse me, that's going to seem quite long, and tackle it as you see fit. And the questions are, what advice would you give to someone who is thinking about a career as an editor and wants some suggestions as to where to start? And to follow on from that, at what stage of a scientific career, or when is the earliest one should start applying for a position as a science editor? Thanks.
Very, very important questions. Thank you. So I'll start my answer with a somewhat flippant comment, and that is, if you are the kind of person who is driven by you being the discoverer of new things, right? Whether it's at a bench, whether it's at a computer, through analysis or through original experimentation, if this is what gets you out of bed, knowing that you are the first person to discover something, nobody in the history of humanity has ever seen that, whatever that might be, then don't leave original research. Don't stop doing what you're doing. For me, in my own career, in my own life, I enjoyed the proximity to discovery. And of course, it was fantastic if I was the one who was doing it, but it never sort of saddened me, or I didn't feel I was missing out if I was the second or the third person to hear about it. So I was as excited about it. Let's say if I came to your lab and you were showing me these latest results, and I knew that as an editor, I could help you share this message, help you verify through peer review, through guidance as an editor. So that's my slightly sort of flippant way of answering the question, a bit of advice as to, you know, whether you stay in doing original research or not. Now, how to get into editing, if you're interested in contributing to the research ecosystem in this other way, and this other way I think is really important. It's really important that individuals who are trained as researchers, who have a researcher perspective, take on other roles, whether it's scientific editing, whether it's journalism, whether it's politics, whether it's policy making. I think it's incredibly important that we have, in all these different roles that I described and others that I have not, that we have people who genuinely understand science and trust in the scientific method and scientific process. There is no special training to become an editor. So all editors at some point go straight from the lab, as it were, to being an editor, and you learn how to be an editor on the job. Most of our editors transition to science publishing at a postdoc stage. Some of them started running an independent group. Some of them join our ranks right after a PhD, but PhD is a minimum requirement. So that gives you a sense of what we look for.
Thank you. And I'm so disappointed that we're almost out of time. And so I'm going to end with one question. I apologize that I didn't get to all the questions in the chat. So I'm going to end with the question from Clarissa, who's been waiting. So thank you, Clarissa. Is what do you think is the future of publishing in Nature? And are there any innovations coming soon, and how can we be part of it?
Wow, we only have 4 minutes. Can we have another hour?
I wish we could, and I'm sorry that, you know, it's such an exciting seminar.
So I think the future is really exciting, actually. There are a number of aspects. I'll just very sort of telegraphically mention some of the ones that I'm really excited by. I think, you know, our desire to continue our expansion beyond the natural sciences towards publishing right across the disciplines. At some point, Nature was not publishing, for example, in public health, was not publishing clinical research, was not publishing applied sciences such as engineering or even social sciences. And one of the things, we all know, we touched on it in the context of collaborations, these siloed boundaries between disciplines or among disciplines are really not helpful. The pandemic has shown us, right? You have to think beyond disciplines. A simple example to illustrate my point, it's all very well and good to use molecular biology and clinical trials to develop a vaccine. If you don't understand social sciences, people are not going to take the vaccine. So it's not going to be very effective in the end. So that's one example. Another example is, we increasingly, this is a journey we started quite some time ago, but we're increasingly interested in championing open science. We know that through our editorial work, we can support researchers in practicing open science. That is tremendously exciting to me. Related to, maybe mostly related to the first point, where we're interested in publishing in increasingly diverse topics, we're interested in publishing from increasingly diverse researchers from different parts of the world, from different demographic constituencies. This needs support because of historic injustice, but there's an amazing opportunity that we want to take, and an amazing contribution that we can take, and of course with many others. It's a collective effort. We increasingly interested in publishing, negative results, null results. Some of the journals in the Nature portfolio, which is the portfolio that Nature is part of, publish, for example, registered reports. We don't offer that format on Nature itself yet, but yet is the operative word here. We are increasingly interested in studies that have pre-registered the study before a paper has been published. So just to give you a flavor of the sort of different directions, and I would say, watch this space. These are great ambitions, and we do have ambitious goals, but if we're going to achieve any of it, we're going to need your support in doing that. So we're in it together. Coming back to collaborations again, you see.
Thank you very much. And it sounds like it's certainly a very exciting future. So definitely I'll be watching that space. And unfortunately, we're at the end of the series of today. So I'm going to hand it back to Sharon with just a big thank you from me. And I'm really looking forward to see what comes next. So over to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to bring the meeting to a close now. But before I do, I really want to express my thanks to Magdalena and to Catherine for a really fascinating discussion, and to the audience actually for your very thoughtful questions. And also thanks again to Magdalena for offering to give advice and feedback to people on this call who are interested in a career as an editor. And you will find Magdalena's email address in the chat if you'd like to go there. So the next Women in COG meeting is on the 11th of November, when we will be talking with Dr. June Rain, who's the chief executive at the MHRA, or Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. So details are on our website, but that's at 12:15 on the 11th of November. If you're interested to hear more from us on SARS-CoV-2 sequencing, do join our next COG-UK Science Showcase event on the 7th of October, during which we'll have a series of talks on sequencing during the pandemic that support some of our key national core studies, including the REACT study and the ONS study. So details of that is on the COG website. So thank you so much for joining us and supporting this event. So wishing you a very good afternoon and goodbye.
Thank you.